Hi, I'm Andrew Connell, and I'm a Microsoft MVP in the area of Microsoft 365 development. And I have a lot of experience with SharePoint development, including all of the different development models that we've had, Microsoft Graph development, Microsoft Teams development, and developing add-ins for Microsoft Office, as well as working with Microsoft Identity, including Azure AD. Developers can use adaptive cards to create engaging messages that are rendered into native UI that adapts to the hosted app experience. Adaptive cards are authored in JSON and can be used for Outlook Actionable Messages, Microsoft Teams conversations, and many other host applications. In this unit, you'll learn about adaptive cards, where they can be used, and how to create adaptive cards with the Online Designer. Adaptive cards are platform-agnostic snippets of UI authored in JSON that apps and services can openly exchange. When delivered to a specific app, the JSON is transformed into native UI that automatically adapts to its surroundings. It helps design and integrate lightweight UI for all major platforms and frameworks. The cards are created using an open card exchange format, enabling developers to exchange UI content in a common and consistent way. Adaptive cards can be rendered natively into host applications such as Outlook, Microsoft Teams, Microsoft Windows, and even custom applications. The goals of adaptive cards are as follows. They're portable to any app, device, and UI framework. They're open, and libraries and schema are open sourced and shared. They're low cost, which means they're easy to define and easy to consume. They're also very expressive because they can be targeted at a long tail of content that developers want to produce. They're also 100% declarative, which means no code is needed or allowed to implement adaptive cards. They're also automatically styled, and this means that they're going to inherit the look of the host application's UX and brand guidelines. Adaptive cards offer plenty of benefits to card authors and experience owners. Adaptive cards are great for card authors. They're going to allow you to just have one schema so that you can get a single format, minimizing the cost of creating a card and maximizing the number of places where it can be used. Your content can also more closely align with what you want to say because you have a richer palette to paint with. And you also have broad reach, which means your content's going to work across a broader set of applications without you having to learn brand new schemas. And finally, you can also have input controls that allow your card can have include input controls for gathering information from the user that is viewing the card. Finally, you have better tooling. An open card ecosystem means better tooling that is shared by everyone. If you are an app developer who wants to tap into an ecosystem of third-party content, you're going to love adaptive cards for the following reasons. You get a consistent user experience because you're going to get a guarantee that a consistent user experience for your users when your cards are rendered because you own the style of the rendered card. You also get a native performance, which you're going to get the performance as it targets your UI framework directly. Content is also delivered in safe payloads so that you don't have to open up your UI framework to raw markup and scripting. You also get off-the-shelf libraries to easily integrate on any platform that you're going to support. You also save time because you don't have to invent, implement, and document a proprietary schema. And then finally, you're going to save time because you don't have to create custom tooling to implement your adaptive cards. The current version of the adaptive card schema is version 1.2, and all elements of the adaptive card schema display the version when they are introduced into the schema. Developers in the documentation. Developers should note what elements are supported in specific schema versions because some application hosts may not currently support the latest version of the schema. The schema is broken up into multiple categories: cards, card elements, containers, actions, types, and inputs. The adaptive card schema evolved from a messaging card format that originated from Microsoft Outlook. Today, Microsoft recommends using adaptive cards in new applications. The root JSON object is the adaptive card that defines the schema, the type, and the version properties. These properties define the metadata about the card. Additional properties include things like the body, which is where the card elements are going to show in the primary card design, an action section that's going to show in the card's action bar, a select action that will be invoked when the card is tapped or selected, and a show card action. Those aren't supported in the selected action. And then you also have fallback text, which is going to be shown when the client doesn't support the version specified. Card elements include the different controls that can be added to the body property on the card. These include elements such as text block, which is going to display text allowing control over the font sizes, weight, and color. You can display an image. You can display a media player for audio or video content. You can define a source for media content using the media source element. You can define an array of rich inline content for allowing inline text formattings. And then you can also define a run of text, which is a single run of formatted text. The container category contains elements to use to group multiple elements together. And these include elements such as an action set that displays a set of actions, a container that groups other containers together, a column set and a column, which divides a region into columns, allowing elements to sit side by side, a fact set and facts, that are elements that are displayed in a series of facts in a tabular form, and an image set that displays a collection of images similar to a gallery. Actions are used to invoke behaviors such as opening a URL, submitting a card, or displaying a card. The open URL action, when invoked, will show the given URL either by launching it in an external web browser or by showing it within an embedded web browser. The submit action gathers input fields, merges with an optional data field, and sends the event to the client. It is up to the client to determine how the data is processed. For example, with the bot framework bots, the client would send an activity through the messaging medium to the bot. The show card activity defines an adaptive card which is shown to the user when the button or a link is clicked. The toggle visibility action toggles the visibility of associated card elements, and the target element action represents an entry for the toggle visibility's target elements property. Inputs are used to collect information from users that can be submitted to the host application or different systems. The text is going to let users input text. Number lets them input numbers. Date, time, you can choose a date or a time. The toggle lets a user choose between two options. A choice set and a choice allows a user to input a choice. The Adaptive Card Designer provides a rich interactive design time experience for authoring adaptive cards. The designer is available from the following URL. That's adaptivecards.io/designer. Whether you are filling out a survey or approving an expense report, or updating a CRM sales opportunity, Actionable Messages in Outlook enable you to take quick actions right from within the Outlook client. Developers can now embed adaptive cards in their emails or notifications, elevating user engagement with their services and increasing organizational productivity. Microsoft Teams supports the latest version of Adaptive Card Schema in multiple extensibility points. Developers can use adaptive cards messages from bots, messaging extensions, and also in task modules. The Adaptive Cards site is your one-stop source for all resources related to adaptive cards, including documentation, samples, and blog posts. The site also hosts a visual designer developers can use to create adaptive cards. So you can launch the designer by going to the Designer tab in the browser or by going to adaptivecards.io/designer. The designer contains multiple panels that serve different purposes that you can see here. So let me move these things around so we can actually see this. Okay, so over here for number one, these are the different card elements, this section over here. And this is a list of all the elements that are available for use within adaptive cards. You also have the rendered card pane right here. And this is a preview rendering of the card. Let's make this a little bit easier to see. This is a preview rendering of the card as it would appear in the currently selected host app. So if I switch it over to Teams, I can see how it would look inside of Microsoft Teams. The card structure, this is the card that's represented in this panel that we have shown here. It's shown as a hierarchical structure here. And if you notice, if you select an element over here, it's going to select the element in the panel itself. And it's going to have it in the corresponding, from the corresponding rendered card over here. So I can select both either way. So if I select this image, you can see it selects the image of this person right here. The element properties are the details of the element that we just selected. these are things that aren't shown inside the data element over here. So it'd be things like some styling and some formatting and stuff. So if it's like text, you can see where we can modify certain things such as the layout or the style of the text. So down here is where we have the payload editor. This is the actual adaptive card itself, and this is the data editor. And this is used when we're working with the templating capability of adaptive cards. So let's go pick an existing sample that we can play with. So I'm going to come over here and select new card, and let's select, let me find the flight itinerary. There it is, flight itinerary. So I'll select this, and what it did is it added the card that you see down here. So I can do I can choose different cards to kind of play with to get a feel for it. Let's go over here and let's go back and let's use the activity update template. So we'll use that. So here's the activity update card. So let's make some changes to this card and see how it impacts both the source and the rendering of the card. So in the card structure, I'm going to select the text block with the person's name. So here we go. We have Matt. I'm going to choose their name. And in the payload editor, I'm going to come over here. I'm going to modify that text. So here we go. Here's the creator's name. So I'm going to change this to Adele Vance. And notice that when I did that, if I scroll back down here, not only did it change over here, but you can see it showing me the value in the card structure, and I can see the text value has been set over here in the text block element properties as well. Now, another thing I can do is I can make a change to the styling. So if I come down here and look at the style, we can change this name for the weight to be lighter. And you can see the text actually just got a little bit lighter. And that was reflected down here. Those two changes were reflected in the actual card element as you see here. And then you can just go preview the card. So one of the cool things about this, I can put the card in preview mode, and I can see what this card would look like if it was actually rendered out. And there's the full rendering of it, of the actual card here. Notice that when I'm in preview mode, that the card structure and the element properties, these aren't going to show up, or they're not going to be rendered when the designer is in preview mode. I can also set the due date to kind of see what the experience is going to look like. So if I select due date, it opened a card up here at the bottom, and then I can go in and modify the values that are actually selected and click OK. And it shows me the details come back from what I actually used there. I can even change it in different experiences. So what if I wanted to look at this as Microsoft Teams dark theme? So here I can see what it looks like in preview mode as well. And here if I select the due date, switch it back to preview mode, I set the due date, and I can see what that due date experience looks like if I was going to use this inside of Microsoft Teams. Now, let's go about creating a brand new card. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy in a block of code that I have, or a block of markup that I have that's going to be used to render out a planet. And so what you see here is I'm rendering out a planet for planet Mars. Now, one of the cool things that we can do with adaptive cards, it has a templating capability. It's going to simplify the reuse of cards by disconnecting the card layout from the data inside the card. So the layout of the card is implemented as JSON, except the values of the data-driven properties that we can indicate with a property name from the data, which we surround it with these curly brackets. This data is expressed as JSON, and at runtime, the adaptive card SDKs will merge the two JSON structures together. So for example, let's go set the value of this text box control to a planet for our planet name. So here we have Mars. And let's go modify the value of this. We're going to bind this to something else. So I'm going to change the value of this property here to planet name. And I have to use this $sign right here to go through and indicate that that's going to be bound. And then what you can see here, you can see the planet name is showing up here at the top. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a structure of my entire card. Like now that you saw I just did that, let's go replace all the values of this card. So I'm going to switch all these out. Now you can see we have all of these different things that are being specified as different templating, as a template for our layout. Now nothing looks correct right now, and that's perfectly fine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a data structure for my card right here, and I'm going to paste it into the sample data editor. And so I have a data element that looks like Mars. And now when I look at the card, now you can see it's rendered out using the data from this property. I could change this and say Venus, and we can see that the title of our card actually changed. And what's neat about this is it allows us to have our cards be much more reusable in our applications. So here I can swap one out for Saturn. We can see we even swapped out the Saturn image, and we have the text and everything for Saturn. So in this little demo, what you saw is how to create and test adaptive cards using the online designer, as well as the technology of templating our adaptive cards as well. Adaptive cards are used to create actionable messages in Outlook to extend the functionality of email. They're going to enable users to take quick actions without ever leaving Outlook. So in this unit, you're going to learn what's possible and required with Outlook Actionable Messages. Let's start this unit with an example scenario that demonstrates how developers can use adaptive cards as actionable messages within Outlook. A Contoso employee submits a request to join a private Office 365 group. Office 365 sends an actionable message to the person who owns the group to approve or decline the request. The card included in the message contains all the information the approver might need to quickly understand who submitted the request and any message that they included to explain their request. It also includes approve and decline actions that can be taken right from Outlook. The owner approves the request and the card updates to include the outcome. The new member of the group submits a second request to add her team members to the group. Office 365 sends an actionable message to the owner with clear information about who submitted the request and the new members to add. The recipient can approve all, some, or none of the proposed new members. The owner approves one new member, and the card updates to indicate the outcome. The approved member is no longer selectable, while the remaining member remains selectable. The owner declines the other requested new member, and the card updates to indicate the outcome. Both members are no longer selectable, and the action buttons are removed. Notice the important points in this scenario. The group owner is able to process the group membership request decisions entirely through their Outlook client. Next time the group owner performs an action, the card is refreshed without receiving additional emails. The group owner can perform all necessary actions without ever leaving Outlook. Whether you are filling out a survey, approving an expense report, or updating a CRM sales opportunity, actionable messages enable you to take quick actions right from within Outlook. Developers can now embed actions in their emails or notifications, elevating user engagement with their services and increasing organizational productivity. Office 365 provides two solutions to enhance productivity with Outlook Actionable Messages: actionable messages via email and actionable messages via Office 365 connectors. Now, this module this section is only going to focus on actionable messages. Outlook introduced the actionable messages card format that over time has evolved into the adaptive card format. Microsoft now recommends developers should use the adaptive card format for actionable messages, as it's the only format supported on Outlook on iOS and Android. Cards are included in an HTML email sent to users, including a script type application/adaptive card plus JSON element in the head element of the email. The message body of the email should still be placed in the body element. Securing actionable emails is simple and easy. There are two phases within the end-to-end experience that impose security requirements on your service when supporting actionable messages with Office 365. Let's explore the sending phase first of an actionable message. In the send phase, the prerequisites for your service to send an actionable messages are as follows. If you are using actionable email, you'll need to enable the sender verification. This does not apply to connector messages. This only applies to an actual email message. Your service must be registered with Microsoft, and the action URL must support HTTPS. The sender verification part is a little bit different. Office 365 requires a sender verification in order to enable actionable messages via email. Your actionable message emails must either originate from servers that implement Domain Keys Identified Mail, or DKIM, and a Sender Policy Framework, SPF, or you must implement sign cards. While DKIM and SPF are sufficient for some scenarios, that solution will not work in some situations where emails are sent via an external provider, which can lead to recipients not experiencing the enhanced actionable message. For this reason, we always recommend, or Microsoft always recommends, implementing signed cards, which will work in all cases and are fundamentally more secure since they do not rely on DNS records, which is what DKIM and SPF require. DKIM and SPF, though, are industry standard ways to prove a sender's identity when sending mail over SMTP. Most companies already implement these standards to secure the emails they are already sending. To learn more about SPF and DKIM, you can refer to the documentation we have linked in the notes for in this slide. And let's talk about signed card payloads. Actionable messages sent via email support an alternative verification method, which is signing the card payload with an RSA key or an X509 certificate. This method is required in the following scenarios: when an SPF or DKIM failure has been caused by the sender setup or recipient tenant set security services in front of Office 365 services, or when your scenario for actionable messages requires sending from multiple email accounts. To use signed cards, you must register your public key in the email developer dashboard and use the corresponding private key to sign the card. Action processing requires a publicly reachable endpoint that is pre-registered using the actionable email developer dashboard. The way it works is as follows. A user is going to receive an email with an actionable message embedded in the script element. That's step one. In step two, the issuer is going to interact, or the user is going to interact with the message action defined in the card, such as an action.http that sends a post request to an API. Step three, the HTTP post message is sent from the endpoint in Office 365 to the pre-registered endpoint. The HTTP post includes the bearer token that should be validated, and that happens in steps 4 and 5. The card is returned in step 6 to return in the HTTP header as a card action status with a value that indicates if it was successful or if it failed. You can optionally also include the response body that can contain a JSON to represent the new UI of the card after successful processing. This requires the card update and body HTTP header set to true, and Outlook, when it receives that, will refresh the existing card with the new card that has been provided. Your action URLs will not work until your URL is registered in the Actionable Email Developer Dashboard. Your service must be registered to make Outlook aware of the following aspects of your actionable message. First, the address of the API endpoint of the actionable message can submit an HTTP post and receive a card refresh from the response. 2 is the email address that is what the email address is that is allowed to send adaptive cards, and 3 is the scope permitted to use the actionable message. Every unique scope, such as My Mailbox, Organization, or Global, must be registered individually and must be reviewed and approved by Microsoft. Developers aren't blocked in the approval. They can send actionable messages to themselves. The cards will render and the actions will work without requiring approval, but the approval is required only to be available to send actionable messages to other people. Now, if you're registering an actionable message for the global scope, your service must meet some additional requirements. Your emails must be authenticated with DKIM or SPF. The top-level domain, or the TLD, of the SPF check or DKIM signature must match the TLD of your from's email address. Emails must come from a static email address, and they must also follow the email sender guidelines. Consistent history. You must have a consistent history of sending a high volume of mail from your domain. You have a very low rate of spam complaints from users. You have high fidelity, routine, and simple actions available for your service. Otherwise, use the OpenURA actions for complex interactions. And actions should be used for transactional email where a high interaction rate is expected. They should not be used for promotional or bulk email. Office 365 will call your configured URL, passing in an authentication header with the value of bearer plus assigned encoded token. Your API should validate the token is issued by Microsoft by checking the digital signature, and you can inspect the bearer token and use the Microsoft.Office365.ActionableMessages.Utilities NuGet package for a .NET Framework v4.6 projects. This package contains a class, the Actionable Message Token Validator, that contains the method validateTokenAsync that can be used to validate the token. This method will verify that the token is issued by Microsoft and its digital signature is valid, and the token is not expired, and that the audience claim matches the service domain. The bearer token also contains additional properties your API could and should use to perform additional verification checks. And the email address of the email sender that included the actionable message can be found in the sender claim. The email address of the sender who received the email and performed the action in this actionable message can be found in the subclaim. If you're using the actionable message token validator class from the NuGet package, these will be exposed in the result as the sender and the action performer properties. Your API should check both of these claims to ensure the correct email address sent the original message and the person who performed the action is also supported, such as people within your organization. When your API receives an HTTP post from the action performer, it responds to the HTTP request indicating a success or a failure along with a message. The success or failure is indicated by returning an HTTP 200 success or an HTTP 400 through 499 failure status code. You can include an additional message to the user by including it in the card action status HTTP response header. And then finally, to refresh cards, after the user completes an action, the card body can be refreshed to include details of the interaction, such as an expense approval number or a support ticket number. To refresh the card, your API must do two things. The first is include a new card as a JSON payload in the body of the HTTP response. And second, it must include the HTTP response header, card update, and body. It must be set to true. Now, when Office 365 receives the new card in the response from the HTTP post action, it will update the email to use the new card. In this demo, you're going to use adaptive cards to implement an engaging user experience using Outlook Actionable Messages. So we're going to create two separate projects, or these projects are already created in my demo here, and we're just going to walk through them and configure them and show you how they work. We're also going to have to register an app in two different portals to implement a complete solution. So there's four pieces to this. The first piece is to create an Azure AD application that's going to be used to send email using the Microsoft Graph. And we need that in order to create the email, to send it, and to include an adaptive card in the header portion of the email, of the HTML email. The second step is we're going to use the Azure AD app and a .NET Core console app that's going to send the email using Microsoft Graph, and it's going to leverage that Azure AD app, and that's going to include the adaptive card in the message. The adaptive card in step 3, or the third piece, the adaptive card is going to be rendered in the email, and when the user that is looking at the email submits the adaptive card, the form in the adaptive card, it's going to send the results to an API to record the user's feedback and update the card in the email. And the way we're going to do that to receive the form submission and to update the email is to create a REST API that is going to receive the form submission and respond with an updated card that Outlook will use to update the existing message. That's going to be done using a Node.js-based web service. Now, in order for that web service to receive the request or the HTTP request from Outlook and to respond, we're going to have to register our service in the Outlook Actionable Email Developer Dashboard. Okay, so let's start with step 1. That's going to be creating an Azure AD application. So here I'm already logged in to my Azure AD Admin Center. And I'm going to come over here to the Active Directory and say app registrations and create a new registration. I'm going to call this my adaptive card mailer. I'm going to leave it as single tenant for now. Now, once I go through and register it, the next thing that I'm going to need to do is I'm going to go ahead and collect some information here. So the app ID and the tenant ID, I know I'm going to need those later. So I'm going to go ahead and copy those and just paste those into a text file off to the side, and we'll use that. We'll use those in a few moments. Now, the next thing I need to do is I need to set up authentication. So if I come over here and look at the authentication, I'm going to add a platform, and we're going to use a mobile and desktop app because we're going to use a console application for this to send our email. The console app doesn't, it's just going to ask us to log in, and then it's going to send the email to the user that logged in. So in this, we're going to use a redirect URI of a native client because everything's going to be running locally in a desktop app or a console app on my laptop. So I'll just say native client is the redirect URI we're going to use, and I'll click configure. And then the other thing we're going to do is I'm going to also set the default client type. I'm going to treat it as a public client. And what a public client is this is a client that is going to be distributed like a desktop app or a mobile app. And this differs from a confidential client because a confidential client is is one where you can secure the secret for the app and the client ID. But a public client is one that's distributed. And if it's distributed, the secret is really no longer a secret because somebody who gets that app could take a look at it. So you have to opt into this and say you want it to be treated as a public client because what we're going to do is we're going to use this resource owner password credential. And this is not the best security practice for a production app. Because resource owner password credential is effectively the way that's going to work is my console app is going to request the user's login or sign in and sign in and password to log in on their behalf. And the better approach is that our applications should never receive a username and password. Instead, we should always go ask the user to go log in and then come back. But frankly, we're focused on adaptive cards here, and I don't want to overcomplicate our sample. And so we're just going with a very, very simple authentication implementation. But just know that in a production app, you might want to think differently about how you go to implement this and maybe not use resource owner password credential. Okay, so I've saved my changes, and I've set this up. The next thing we need to do is need to grant a permission. So I'm going to go to API permissions. I'm going to add a new permission. We're using Microsoft Graph. It's going to be a delegated permission, and we want to be able to have this app to be able to use the mail.send permission. So go ahead and add it. Now, again, back to what I just said a second ago, we want to focus on just the adaptive cards capability here. And this console app is just serving a purpose to send an email for us. So I don't want to dwell on the proper way to do production style apps with the Microsoft Graph. This is just an ends to a means or a means to an ends to be able to get our email sent to ourselves. And the reason I bring this up again is because the user who logs in should be prompted with some sort of a consent dialog to grant the permission, to delegate the permission to the app to act on their behalf. But then we would have to create some interface for that to happen as well. But the easy way of doing this is as an administrator, I can just go ahead and grant consent to this permission for this app for everyone in my organization. Again, you should really only consider doing this in a developer environment. In a production environment, you'd have the user should be able to should have the ability to go through and set that. So I'm just keeping things simple for now. Okay, so now that we have all this stuff set up, our app is now set up. Let's go take a look at our console app. So our console app, I'm going to walk through all the code for this in just a moment. But we need to go through and do some configuration to it first. So here in the app settings JSON, I have a space set up for the tenant ID and the application ID. So let's go grab those values. Tenant ID was this value, and my application ID was this value. And I got these, remember, from the Azure AD app that I just created. Okay, so now let's go look at the code for this. So this code is available as a resource in the module that this screencast is associated with. So I don't want to go into too much depth here on how we're logging into Microsoft Graph and getting a token and all that stuff. We're just going to focus on sending the email. So what does this app do? What this does is we're going to load our settings from our configuration file, and then we're going to prompt the user for their username and their password. And I'm going to use that configuration information and the credentials to go obtain an instance of the Microsoft Graph a client using the .NET SDK for Microsoft Graph. And then I'm going to call send email and wait for it to finish. So I'm going to send an email using this client to this email address. So let's just look at this code, at the send email code, and see what this does. So what this is going to do is it's going to create a new email message as a Microsoft Graph entity using the .NET SDK for Microsoft Graph. And I'm going to set the subject and the two recipients. So it's going to be an email is going to be sent to the email address of the current user. And as we talked about in the previous section, you can go send adaptive cards to yourself in development without going through the approval process. So this is going to simplify things by just focusing on this. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to set the body of the email to be an HTML style email, and we want to set the content of the email equal to this message card body. So let's see what this does. Oh, and once we create the email, I'm then going to use graph.me.send email. This is the email we're going to send. I'm going to create the request, and I'm going to post it asynchronously, and I'm going to use the await keyword for this. And as you saw, we were going to then use the wait method for this to finish. So loading the card message. So what's happening here? So what I'm going to do is I'm loading in an entire email body we'll look at in just a second. And in there's a placeholder. So actually, let's go look at that now. So here's the email that we're going to send. There is nothing really special to this, except for really this section right here, where you can see in the head, there is a script with type application/adaptive card plus JSON with a placeholder. And then it's just got some standard text here as well in the body. So if I come back over to our app, once I've loaded in the body of the email, I'm then going to go load in an adaptive card. And if I go look at this adaptive card, what you'll see here is this adaptive card has a little bit of text in it. So we have a text block. We have a section here with this message that just says, "I hope you enjoyed this webinar." And then it gives them a choice set on what they thought about the webinar. It was fantastic, it was just okay, or they were disappointed in it. And then we have a place for them to enter in some comments. And finally, we have an action, an HTTP action that's going to issue a post. And the title of the post is going to say submit feedback. That's what the button's going to say. And it's going to post it to this address. Now, we're going to have to fix this domain in just a minute. And we're going to do that. We'll do that in a couple minutes. But we'll come back to this. I want to show this working first. And then the body of the email that's going to be sent, the body of the request, is going to include a JSON object, which will have a rating property, and it'll have the rating value that they selected, which the rating is coming from our choice set. And then the comment is coming from the comment property as well that we have here. Okay. So once we've loaded in, well, let's see, that's the wrong one. Let's come back over here to this. Okay, so now once we've loaded in the message body and the card, we're simply going to use the string.format to replace that placeholder with the card. All right, so let's see this run. So I'm going to go ahead, let's back up, and let's do a .NET build and a .NET run to create our app. Now it's going to go prompt us to log in. There we go. And then it's going to prompt for our password. And it should send the email. Okay, it says the email was sent. So now let's come back over to the browser and let's go to mail.office365.com. And here we can see that our email was sent just in the last few minutes. So here we go. There's the adaptive card that's being rendered. We can see we have our different choice set and we have a place to enter some text. Now I'm going to go ahead and choose an option here and say submit feedback. And what you'll see is I'm going to get an error here that says we got a 404 remote endpoint returned an error. Well, that's because we were using an invalid URL. It was pointing to a non-existent address. That's something we're going to have to fix. So we're going to come back to that in just a few minutes and get that and fix that URL in just a few minutes. Okay, so the next step that we need to do is I need to create my endpoint that's going to receive the request when this form is submitted, and we want to be able to respond back to Outlook or Office 365 with a new card, and I want this card refreshed after they've filled this out. So the way we do that is I have another app that I've created here, and it's a Node.js based application that we're going to use to spin up a web service. So again, this is also provided to you as part of the module and the code download that's associated with this screencast. So I'm not going to go through all of this. I want to just explain what's going to happen here, mostly from a high level. Our application is going to have a few environment variables that are going to be set. So we have things like the host name, the allowed sender, and the performer domain. And so the way this is going to work is the host name. This is going to be the URL of the site or of the web service that's going to be exposed. The allowed sender is going to be the name of the email address of the person or the mailbox that sent the email to a user with the adaptive card in it, because we don't want to process requests that are submitted from Outlook for emails that we didn't send or that we didn't expect. I don't want some random person sending an email to my user. And this is just a good practice of something you should do. You should verify that the email address that someone sent them is valid. So it's kind of like making sure you're almost checking the issuer of a token in a way. The other part is the action performer. And so this is simply saying, I want to make sure that the person who completed the form in Outlook is a member of my organization. And I can do that by checking the domain of their email. So I'm going to need to set a couple different properties here in my .env. So remember, we had our user, Megan, is the one that's going to send the email. So I'm going to go ahead and add Megan in this list, and her domain is going to be the domain that we trust. And then I've also got to set the host name and the port name. Now, when this application would run in production, I'd want to go set these environment variables. I'm using the .env as a development trick to do this. And I'm using a package to do that in this project. It's the package .env. Okay. So what's going to happen with the code for this? So now what it's going to do, if I look at this web server, this is a pretty standard web server that we're spinning up here. So we're spinning up our web server, and then we're going to be listening for an HTTP post to the endpoint /API/card. And what that's going to do is that's going to parse out all of the headers, and it's going to make sure that that it pulls the token out of the request. Okay, so the token that's going to be included in the authorization header, and the value is bare space with the token. And so all I'm doing here is making sure that there's an authorization header, fetching out the value from the authorization header, and I'm splitting it into an array. So it's going to be bare space token. And so I'm splitting it up into an array where the second position in the array is the token itself. So if we didn't get a token, well, that's a problem. So we're going to kick back a 401. The next thing we need to do is we're going to validate the token. Now, let me explain what this code right here is doing, where I'm creating a validator is doing, and the result that I'm getting back for this. And this is all defined inside of this file, this actual message token validator, which uses this OpenID metadata. In the section, in the slides that we talked about just a minute ago, we talked about how there was a NuGet package from Microsoft for .NET Framework 4.6 projects. That was a utility library. It was going to make things easier for you. So we don't have that in Node.js. We also don't have that for .NET Core, at least at the time of the recording. So let me explain what this code does, just to keep things a little simple for you. So when Microsoft, or the way that OpenID works, OpenID Connect works, is that there's a well-known endpoint. And that well-known endpoint that anybody can go take a look at, let's see, right here, this well-known endpoint that you see listed right here, this is going to return back either one or multiple keys. And these keys, these are like SSL keys or X509 keys. And what these are is it's a public key. And so when Office 365, what they're going to do is they're going to create the message. They're going to take the entire adaptive card and the message that's being sent to me, and they're going to encode it, or they're going to sign it using the private key. This URL is going to list out all of the public keys. Okay. And so what the code is doing when I do this actionable message validate the token, the token validator, and I'm calling validate token, what this code's going to do is it's going to take the token, it's going to reach out to Office 365, it's going to grab a list of all the keys that they are currently using, the public keys that they're currently using. It's going to find the key. There's only one that it's going to return in this case. It's going to take the key that it found, and I'm going to use that key to encode the body of the request, and I'm going to use that and compare that string to the string that's in the token that was in the request header. If those values match, then I know that the request that I received is identical to the one that was sent from Office 365 because the two values match using the public key and the private key pair. If they don't match, then the token's not valid. So this is just ensuring that the token is valid, right? And so it comes back and it just says, hey, there's an error with what happened, and it'll tell me what the actual message was. When the token is valid, that simply just tells me that it came from Office 365. So I know that I can trust who sent it. Now what I want to do is I want to look at the actual result coming from this validate token response here, which is coming out as this valid result. And it has two properties. It has a sender property and an action performer. Well, we talked about that earlier. I want to make sure that the sender of the original email that was sent to a user that contained the adaptive card is my allowed sender email address. And the action performer, I want to ensure that the person that submitted the action, their email address matches the domain that I was expecting. All right. So this is just making sure that, okay, even though we knew it came from Office 365, which is all of this stuff, I want to make sure that it's a request that I'm supposed to respond to. Okay, so at this point, everything looks good. So the next thing that I'm going to do, the token's valid, the sender's valid, and the person who processed the request is valid. So the next thing I want to do is I want to do the work. And what the work is going to do here is that this is simply going to load in some fake feedback from some people who had already responded to this survey. So what did they think about the webinar? Shows the name of the person, their voting score, and some comments. So I'm going to load in this fake feedback. I'm then going to get the body of the request from the adaptive card that was submitted. I'm going to push that into that collection of feedback. And then all this code is going to do all of this code's going to do right here is this is just going to process all of the feedback, and it's going to generate a new JSON object that contains properties such as what's the average result of the votes, how many votes do we have, and then maybe the top 3 or the top 4 most recent responses. So once I have that object, I'm then going to use the Adaptive Cards Templating SDK to take an adaptive card and then merge in the data from this object that I generated up here into that template. And so if you take a look at the card itself that we're going to respond with, and let's turn on word wrapping, you can see here that it's going to say, thank you for your feedback. It shows right here, thanks. V3 is just making just an extra little string there. It's going to show the average rating is going to use this thing. It's going to get replaced when the templating SDK sees this. It's going to replace average rating with the rating object in my JSON object. It's going to do the same thing for the total response. And then a little bit farther down, it's going to do the same thing for my fact set and return back all of the results. Okay, so now that I have all of that, now I have my data, I then need to return back. Now I have this card that I built up, I need to return that back to Office 365 and Outlook. And the way I'm going to do that, I'm going to come over here and say action card status. I'm going to set the header value of an action card status equal to the webinar feedback was received. So it's just a notice that to Outlook that we got a response. And then I'm also going to tell it card update and body is true. And so when I return an HP status of 200, which is an OK, I'm then going to return the card itself in the body. When Outlook gets that, this is going to say, hey, go update the existing adaptive card that you have in the email with what you have right here. And then response.end, and everything is going to work just fine, and everything's in good shape. Now, the last step that I'm going to have to do here before I run this is that I'm going to need to register the service with the actionable email developer dashboard. So the registration is going to require a full URL where the service is located. Now, in order for Outlook to send a post request to our endpoint running on our development machine, I need to use a tool that's going to create a tunnel from a routable URL down to the localhost URL that I'm going to have when I run my web service. And the tool I'm going to use for that is a tool called ngrok. It's a freely available tool that you can install on your machine. And what this is going to do is this is going to create a public route at https:// some random subdomain .ngrok.io, and it's going to redirect that to the localhost endpoint on my machine, and it's going to also give me an HTTP and an HTTPS route to this. So let's come over to let's start up a command prompt. This tool runs on both Windows and Mac OS and Linux. I'm going to say ngrok HTTP, and I know my web service is going to be running on port 3007. So I'm going to go ahead and spin this up. So here we can see there's our URL that has been created. And so any request to that URL is going to get routed to this address here. So a couple things I need to do. First of all, let's grab this domain here, and I'm going to need to come over to our .env and put in that right here in our host name to know where it's actually coming from. Okay, so I'm going to go through and add that first. Now, let's come over to our actionable dashboard. We have not spun up our web service yet. And the reason why we didn't spin up our web service is because these environment variables will only be captured when the web service runs. All right, so let's go to the https aka.ms/publish Outlook Actionable Message, OAM. All right, so now let's come over here and let's create a new provider. And this is going to be our Outlook Actionable Message. Let's just call it our adaptive card responder. We have a mailer and we have a responder. So what email address will they come from? Well, we already know that. That's going to be coming from Megan's email address. What target URLs do you want to hit? Well, I want to be able to hit, as we just saw a second ago, this domain, so HTTPS, and then I want to add on /API/card, because if you remember from our code, we are listening for responses in our web service there from /API/card. Okay, so now let's come back over to the dashboard. There we go. It's asking us for public keys. I don't need to set that in. We're not going to do that. We're not going to set that right now because we're just doing stuff in development. The scope of submission, remember we said we had to define our scope. I'm going to say it's going to just be for test users, and our test users that we want to play with is just going to be our user that we're going to be signing in with. So these will be automatically approved. I'm going to say accept, hit save, and there we go. We've got it automatically approved, and we are now in good shape. So now, a couple things we have to do here. What I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to go spin up our process. All right. So let's go spin up our web service. So I'm going to come over here to Visual Studio Code. We got our .env set up. Yep, we're in good shape there. So now let's come over here and let's do. Let's see. We have I think our package.json. There we go. So I have a start server. All right. So I'm going to say npm run start server. Oh, npm install. So this is going to go download all the dependencies for our project, which I hadn't done previously. And now I can say start the web server. So it's building everything, spinning it all up, and now we can see our web server is now running on port 3007, and we also have in the background we have our ngrok is running as well. So let's come over here to our console app, and I need to make a change inside of the adaptive card because we need to set it with the domain for our service. Oh, that's not correct. Let's go find that domain again. .env. This is what we want to use, and we'll just replace this with our subdomain. Okay. Now, before we send this, let's come back over to the browser and let's make sure that that email address is gone because it has the bad email address. So now we can go back to our console app and let's go rerun our console app to send this email to Megan. Here, and we got our password. There we go, email has been sent. So now if I come back over to the browser, there we go, email just showed up. Okay, so now here we go. Now we want to test this out. So here's how this is going to work. We are going to say that the webinar is fantastic, and it's like, this was so much better than I expected. Okay, now what we want to do is if we look at our iTerm, or we look at our console with ngrok running, you will see our request actually show up over here, and we should get a response back, and we should see the payload actually change. I'm going to go ahead and hit submit, and we got an error here that an invalid sender or the action performer is not allowed. So let's go back to our code. Oh, and I know what the problem is. Notice here we have a capital M. I remember from our code. Let's go ahead and stop the web service for a second. If I come back over here in our code, we were looking at authorization header, coming down a bit farther. We looked for the action performer and we were converting it all to lowercase, so it's not matching. So that's going to be an easy fix. So we'll just grab this entire string and we'll set that to lowercase and save our changes. And let's double check and see if our allowed sender, if we did the same. Yep, our allowed sender, it was the same. So we should do that as well for Megan up here. There we go. Save our changes and let's spin up the web server again. And we will go off the email and come back. And this time we'll say the same thing. This was so much better than we expected. And submit our feedback. There, and now we can see our card was automatically updated. It shows Megan's last response was added to, it was so much better than expected. We have our average rating set up here because we have a 3, a 3, a 2, yeah, 2 1s and 2 3s average out to 2, and then there's our 2 right there. And it lists out the number of people that responded. So neat. You are able to see how to send an email as an adaptive card and then respond to that adaptive card and update it from a web service in this demo. In this module, you're going to learn how to use adaptive cards in Microsoft Teams, as they can be used in task modules, tabs, bots, and messaging extensions. Developers building custom apps for Microsoft Teams can use adaptive cards in various extensibility points, and some of these options include the following. Task modules, which are dialogues in Microsoft Teams, these are implemented as something called a task module. A task module can be either a web page that's loaded within an iframe or an adaptive card. You can also have a conversational bot that's built using the Microsoft Bot framework, and it can reply to a message or send a proactive message as a text-based message or as an adaptive card. Messaging extensions can pre-fill or add content to an existing message. This content can then be in the form of a text message, or it can be an adaptive card. One way you can create adaptive cards is not just using the Adaptive Card Design Studio that's hosted on the adaptivecard.io website, but you can also design them using the App Studio app that's available to everyone inside of Microsoft Teams. Task modules are dialogues in Microsoft Teams, and developers have the option to implement a task module in one of two ways. You can do it as an iframe web page where the task module points to a URL of an HTML page that's rendered within an iframe, and the task module then pops up as it looks like a dialogue, but it'll load the web page in that iframe, which shows up as a dialogue. The other option is using an adaptive card, and the task module can render an adaptive card in the contents of the task module pop-up window. You can also use adaptive cards and task modules that they're all in the way that they're going to follow all of the nearly the same requirements as an HTML-based task module. Instead of passing in a URL, you simply just pass in a card with the card that you want to have rendered. One of the differences is how you create the task module. So task modules are invoked by passing a populated instance of the task info object in the Microsoft Teams.task.start task method. For an HTML-based task module, you set the address of the web page, load it in the task module in the task info.url property. Now, when you're using an adaptive card, you're going to assign the JSON of the card to the .card property on the task info object. Another difference in the adaptive cards is the parameter of the callback method that's defined when invoking this task module with the start task method. The values of all the input controls defined in the adaptive card are returned in a single object, a result object, in the callback method that's passed back. Now let's talk about conversational bots. In Microsoft Teams, these are implemented using the Microsoft Bot Framework. The bot is a web service that is registered with the Bot Framework and has Microsoft Teams channel has been enabled. Your custom web service that sends replies and messages to Microsoft Teams can send text messages or messages as adaptive cards. The message is sent via the Bot Framework to Microsoft Teams that knows how to render each type of message. Now, the following code demonstrates the sending a message to a newly created channel when the channel is created. So here in the on Teams channel created event runs, we're going to create a card using the cardFactory.AdaptiveCard method, and we're going to pass in the JSON for the card. I'm then going to use the message factory object to create a new message and then return that back to Microsoft Teams by calling the turnContext.send activity. Bots can also update messages that they create. The update can replace an existing card, similar to how actionable messages in Outlook can be refreshed. The following code demonstrates how to update an existing message. Notice that the reply to ID property on the activity that activated the turn is going to use the update activity method to update the existing message. So I'm going to take that reply to activity and I'm going to use that as the ID for the attachment that I'm going to return back. And the last one that we have is messaging extensions. In Teams, these enable developers to pre-fill or update a message by searching for the content in an external system, which would be using a search command, or perform an action, which would be an action command. Adaptive cards can be used in both types of messaging extension command types. Search commands are used from the compose box at the bottom of the Microsoft Teams client, either through an @mention or by selecting an extensions icon. The user can search an external system, and the search results are returned as adaptive cards. When a search action is invoked, the bot framework will send an activity object to your web service of type compose extension query with the command ID that you need to respond to with an object containing a compose extension. The object has to respond within 5 seconds of receiving that request. The method handle Teams messaging extension query is called by the bot framework SDK when a message of type compose extension query is received. And the attachment layout property can either be a list of results containing thumbnails, text and text fields, or a grid of thumbnail images. The attachments property is used when a type is set to result and contains an array of supported cards. In this demo, I'm going to use an adaptive card to implement a custom task module in Microsoft Teams. Task modules are used as dialogues in Microsoft Teams to display or collect information from users. So there's two ways we can do task modules. We can do them as a standard web page, or we can do it using an adaptive card. So I'm going to show you two implementations of this. So what we're doing is we're going to use our example here is going to be a YouTube player, and there's going to be two adaptive cards. So the first one is going to be has this player.html. And so what this adaptive card is going to do is this is going to render out, use the YouTube embedded player in a browser. And so we're going to have one adaptive card is going to prompt the user to submit the ID of a YouTube video ID. And the second adaptive card is going to use the browser-based approach for task modules to launch it. And the reason we're doing that is because I need to add in this specific HTML to get the YouTube player to work. So the adaptive card is going to be the first one that's going to show up. So let me show you how we've gone about doing this. So what I've done is I've created a new tab. And this tab is going to be responsible for launching the adaptive card task module. So if we look at the code for this tab, If I scroll down to it, scroll down, there we go, in the render method, what you're going to see here is I'm going to have a button. This button is going to allow me to change a video ID. So it's going to select, or it's going to display a adaptive card when this button is clicked, and I want to, as a task module, and I want to collect the information from that. When it gets the response, it's going to change, it's going to set the state on my React control to be equal to the ID of the video that I want to display. So if I come down here on the on-change video, here's how we're going to do this. So what I'm doing is I'm going to go first load the adaptive card. So what does our adaptive card look like? Well, that's this JSON object here. And what this adaptive card is going to do is it's simply going to have in a header that says it's a YouTube selector, and it's going to prompt you to enter in the ID of a YouTube video. And then it's got an input text for the value of the that you wanted, of the YouTube ID that you want to see, the video ID you want to see. So what let's go back. And then at the very end, when it finishes, it's going to call the action.submit action. All right, so now let's go look at our tab again. What I'm going to do is, now that I've loaded my card, I need to go find in the card, I need to find the item where the ID is equal to YouTube video ID, and I want to set his value equal to the currently selected YouTube video. So that's the first thing I want to do. Now, let's come back over and let's now look at creating our task module. So I created a task module by creating a new task info object. And normally if I want to do an HTML-based or browser-based task module, if I scroll up here, I'll show you one. Let's see, where is it? Change video, show video. There you go. So there's the URL. So what I would normally do is I would just pass in the full qualified URL to where the web page is hosted that implements the task module. But when I'm using an adaptive card, I'm simply going to pass in the adaptive card JSON object into the card property. Now what's neat about this is that what I'm going to do is I'm also going to create this thing called a submit handler. And this is a callback that's going to get back both an error, if one exists, and the result object. The result, when you submit an adaptive card from a task module, is going to have properties for every single one of the input controls in the adaptive card, including my YouTube video ID. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the state on my current React control that has a property called YouTube video ID equal to what came back from the result. And then to launch my task module, I'm going to call Microsoft Teams.task start task with that info object and register my handler. So let's see this in action. So I'm going to go ahead and start my project up by running gulp ngrok serve. This is a Microsoft Teams project that's been built using the Yeoman generator for Microsoft Teams. So it's building up my project, spinning it up, and it's going to host a local host, a web server on our local host, and it's going to expose it using the tool called ngrok, and that's why I ran ngrok serve, setting all that stuff up for me. This process is also going to create my Microsoft Teams app package as well. If you want to see the entire steps for implementing any of the demos that you're seeing in this screencast, go refer to the module that's associated with this screencast. And there is an exercise and a hands-on lab for each one of the different demos that we've run here. Okay, so everything is running. I'm going to go over to Microsoft Teams and I'm going to install my app. So I'm already logged into Microsoft Teams as Megan Bowen. I'm going to come over here to apps, and I'm going to go upload our app. So I'm going to upload a custom app for me and my teams. And let's go find the app that we just created. So that's this app package that was generated in our project folder. So go ahead and say, go ahead and add the app. All right, so there we go. So now our app has been added. So here's our two buttons. We have our tab set up, and we have our two buttons. Now remember, we have one button that if I click Show Video, it launches the YouTube video player as a HTML web page. So this is pointing back to a full-blown HTML page. What I want to do is I want to use my adaptive card, and so that's where I can change the video ID here. So if I select Change the Video ID, I can change the video to a different video that I want to watch. So let's change it to, let's say, a video we have for a module on creating task modules with adaptive cards. So I'll go ahead and hit update, and what you'll see is watch the ID change in the tab, and now when I show the video, we get a different video. And I can use another one. If you want to learn how to do adaptive cards with bots, you could go watch the Teams module on creating conversational bots, and that'll also walk you through using an adaptive card. And so in this demo, what you saw was how we can use adaptive cards with task modules for Microsoft Teams custom apps. Thank you for watching this module. I hope you got a lot out of this, and I hope you learned something. This screencast is has an associated module to go along with it. And that module includes not only slides and demos, but it also includes a hands-on lab that will walk you through all of the steps that we showed here in the demonstration sections of this screencast. So make sure you check out the notes for this video to get access to the module where you'll find more information that you can use to get more about these resources. Thank you very much.